Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy Miller, the creator of the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me. If you would like to support this independent, ad-free, true crime show made for nighttime listening, feel free to do so via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. With every subscription, you enjoy a bonus episode each month. Now, about tonight's episode. I came across this story a couple of weeks ago, and, well, it was so extraordinary, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And usually, if I can't stop thinking about a story, then that's typically a strong sign it's worthy of your time. It's a story about a young mother who was accused of a heinous crime, the worst you can imagine. She swore she was innocent, but just about everyone else believed she was guilty. That is, except for one man, a perfect stranger, the unlikeliest of crusaders, who would make it his mission to find out the truth of what really happened before it was too late. Now, this case, it started all the way back in 2003, but was only recently resolved in the spring of 2026. And it's been reported in local press and a few other places, but I hope someone does a deep dive documentary on this saga, because it's a complicated story, the kind that we are quick to judge, the kind of story that highlights the best and the worst of our criminal justice system. A David and Goliath tale about how one determined individual really can make a difference. This is the Dead Sleep version of events, which means no graphic depictions of violence, but it's important for you to know. This particular episode involves the death of a young child. And I've adapted it in a way that I'm comfortable with, but I just want to let you know before listening. Our story begins in the summer of 2003, somewhere in a rented duplex apartment in the northeast part of Austin, Texas. A young mother named Carmen nursed her newborn baby, enjoying for a moment some peace and quiet. Carmen Mejia was 31 years old, with 4 children, all of them under the age of 6. There was Jose, her son, the oldest, at age 6. Then 4-year-old Anna, then 2-year-old Jennifer, and then her baby girl, who everyone called MC. Carmen also took care of a friend's 10-month-old baby while his mother was in Mexico. The child's name was Abelardo, a name that means strong, brave, noble. And in his brief life, Abelardo was all of those things and more. The boy and his father only began renting a room in Carmen's house a week earlier, but already the boy had become like family. Her other children thought of him as a brother. Things were good. Everyone was safe, which was all Carmen could have hoped for when she first moved to Texas from her native Honduras, roughly 8 years earlier, back in 1995. Life for anyone in Honduras was hard. Carmen was from a rural area, and like 60% of the population, she endured extreme poverty. Carmen never went to school. She was never taught how to read or write. Her childhood was spent working in the fields. She never went to a dentist, rarely went to a doctor. Any illnesses were treated with her grandfather's home remedies. By the time she was an adult, she knew there was nothing for her in Honduras. and that was before the storm. Back in 1998, Hurricane Mitch swept through Honduras. It was a devastating storm, killing roughly 7,000 people and leaving 1.5 million Hondurans homeless. Most of the country's infrastructure was washed away. So even if Carmen did want to go back, there wasn't much left to go back to. Thankfully, Carmen and her husband were here in the States legally with working papers. So her husband, that's Jose Sr., he had a good job working as a roofer in construction. And together, they were building a life for themselves and their young children. That is until that morning, around 9:30 a.m., July 28, 2003, when everything that they'd built was tragically washed away, lost to a whole different kind of storm, a deadly catastrophe Carmen never saw coming. That morning, Carmen didn't even hear the sound of running water, only the scream. Seconds later, her 2-year-old Jennifer came into the room in the best way she could, told her mother that she was needed in the bathroom urgently. Something bad happened. In the bathroom, she saw her daughter Anna by the side of the bathtub. And inside the bathtub, screaming, was little Abelardo. It seemed someone had turned on the hot water in the bathtub and scalded the 10-month-old baby. And she quickly removed the baby from the tub and ran cool water over him, as she learned to do in Honduras. Scald burns from hot water are very common. In fact, they are the #1 cause of burn injury for children under the age of 5. But Carmen didn't know, she couldn't have known, how hot that water actually was. A water heater should be set to a maximum of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 49 degrees Celsius. At 120 degrees, the water feels hot, but for the skin to severely burn, it would take close to 5 minutes. Carmen lived in an older building where the water temperature was not regulated, which meant what was coming out of that bathtub faucet, well, it was closer to 150 degrees. That's roughly 65 degrees Celsius. And at that temperature, a dangerous, even fatal burn can happen in seconds. When she realized the boy's condition was more serious, she called her husband, who worked with the boy's father. Then she ran to a neighbor's place to get some advice. They told her to go to the hospital. And here is where things get complicated, where everything Carmen tried to do right, it seemed to go wrong. The closest clinic was 5 miles away. Carmen thought this clinic would be better and faster than the ER. Carmen borrowed a few bucks from her landlord for gas money. Then she piled all of the kids into the car, along with her friend Juana Lucas, and they made their way to the clinic. By the time they made it to the clinic, it was 12:15 p.m. And when they got there, they discovered the clinic was closed for lunch. Undeterred, Carmen pushed her way in the door and explained the situation. They looked over the boy briefly, then said sorry. They don't treat children under the age of 2. And even if they did, this boy's injuries were too serious. The women would have to take him to a bigger hospital. They recommended taking him to St. David's Medical Center. As Carmen later remembered it, they did not offer to call 911 or get her an ambulance, nor did the women think to ask. They just jumped back in their car, hoping that they had enough gas to make it to their next stop. Carmen had lived in the States long enough to know that health insurance was a big deal, and so she had to stop home, ensure that she got the baby's health insurance information. And it was there she met up with her husband, and they all went to the next destination, St. David's. By then, the baby had grown quiet, and she'd hoped that meant he was getting better. It was 1:30 p.m. when she arrived, approximately 4 hours since the incident in the bathtub. And as the doctors examined the boy's injuries, all Carmen could do was pray. Pray for a miracle. Instead, the nightmare continued. The doctors there told Carmen the boy would need to go to a larger facility, one that had a special burn center. But before they could move the child, they had to stabilize him first. Over the next several hours, they worked to get the boy's temperature down. At around 5:30, he was deemed stable enough to be moved to the next hospital, a pediatric center in downtown Austin. Over the next 4 hours, the boy was treated by the pediatric critical care unit. The surgeons there did their best, but they couldn't save the boy. Young Abelardo Cassiano suffered fatal organ failure, and he passed away at 9:48 that evening, July 28th, 2003. Carmen was shocked. She thought for certain the boy was going to live. Everybody wanted to know what happened. Carmen was still trying to make sense of it herself. Earlier that morning, the children were all watching cartoons. She stepped away to breastfeed her baby. Then, all of a sudden, chaos. She ran into the bathroom. Abelardo was in the tub. Her daughter had turned on the faucet. It was only a matter of seconds. Her daughter would never intentionally hurt the boy. Anna was barely 4 years old, but she was so distraught over what happened. A social worker would later report how the girl was curled up in a fetal position, her arms wrapped around her legs, her face hidden, sobbing. Her older brother was also traumatized. When they asked 6-year-old Jose what happened, the boy hid under a chair and didn't want to talk. Meanwhile, a social worker was tasked with asking Carmen a few questions. Carmen knew this was all a terrible accident, but now she was starting to doubt herself. Would Child Protective Services see it as an accident? Her greatest fear was having her children taken away from her. She'd only stepped away for a minute to feed her baby. Would the social worker see this as her fault? Carmen couldn't afford to take that chance. Suddenly, the truth, it wasn't good enough. So she did what a surprising number of innocent people do when they confuse feeling guilty with being guilty. Fearful, panicked, innocent people will spontaneously come up with what they think is a simpler, more believable story, then reveal the imperfect, complicated truth. And so that's what she did. Carmen lied, distancing herself and her children as far away from the incident as she could. It was a shameful lie, but it was plausible. She was just swapping out one accident for another. She said that it was the little boy who had done it to himself, that he'd accidentally knocked a pot of hot water off of the stove. But Carmen was not a sophisticated liar, and it seemed pretty obvious to the social worker that she was hiding something. And she shared her suspicions with the police. At 11:30 that evening, Carmen was taken to the local police station. They just wanted to ask her a few questions, starting with, what happened? Carmen repeated the lie about the boiling hot water on the stove. But the social worker had already tipped them off, and they'd sent investigators to check out that story. And they wanted her to know it wasn't possible. The little boy wasn't even close to being tall enough to have reached that pot on the stove. So Carmen tried a different story, claiming the baby must have gotten in the bathtub by himself and done it. They told her they spoke with the boy's father, and he said there was no way his son could have gotten in the tub by himself. So they asked her again what happened. And she told another story. And for the police, this one was the most desperate, pathetic one yet. In this version of events, now the father had something to do with it. An altercation that resulted with the baby ending up in the water. They checked the father's alibi, and he was at work at the time. They told Carmen to stop lying, though to be fair, she wasn't the only one fudging the facts. Carmen didn't know it, but her husband had secured an attorney who went to the police station to find Carmen at around midnight. Only when he asked to see his client, Carmen Mejia, he was told she wasn't there. Over the next 14 hours, detectives would question Carmen until she finally broke down and told the truth. That she wasn't even in the room, but it was one of her children who turned on the hot water. And from there, she explained everything in as much detail as she could. Of course, by then, they didn't believe her. The only thing more twisted than blaming the child's father is trying to pin this on your own children. But even if they had believed her, it wouldn't have mattered. Because this truthful confession, well, it was never recorded. For some inexplicable reason that is still unknown to this day, this portion of Carmen's interview was never recorded, which meant they didn't have the actual truth about what happened anywhere on tape. Only the lies, just as troubling. In a stunning case of complete incompetence, the authorities also lost the videotapes of her children explaining what happened that day. The day after Abelardo died, the social workers taped the children explaining their version of events. Not everything the children said made complete sense, but the most consistent detail was also the most important. Each one of the children said their mother was not in the bathroom when it happened. Now, the kids were young, 2, 4, and 6. But this recorded testimony, it could have gone a long way in helping Carmen's case. Maybe even getting the whole thing thrown out. Somewhere between the social worker and the evidence room, those tapes got lost, and they would never be found. Now that detail would be discovered later. But that night, the police seemed more focused on finding reasons why Carmen was guilty, wondering if they had enough to charge her with murder. Now, they didn't have any physical evidence tying Carmen directly to the incident, nor did they have a motive as to why Carmen might have done it. But based on her behavior, she appeared distant, disconnected, along with those lies that she told. They were convinced she'd killed that boy. All they needed now was the medical examiner to weigh in and determine once and for all, was this an accident or a homicide? Since joining Travis County back in 1995, Dr. Elizabeth Peacock had performed an estimated 4,000 autopsies. But the death of a child, it was heartbreaking especially at the hands of someone who was supposed to be the child's caretaker. Dr. Peacock wasn't a detective. She was a scientist, an MD. But all of the information that she had about this case, it came from the detectives. And the detectives were clear that they believed that this was no accident. And they had a woman in custody who was spinning all kinds of stories about what happened, and they didn't believe any of it. They believed whatever happened, it was done intentionally. So what did Dr. Peacock think? Maybe a different medical examiner in a different county would have ruled it was an accident. But Dr. Peacock, sadly, she'd seen this before. Just 6 months earlier, back in January 2003. There was a 20-year-old girl. Her name was Rosa Heinous, who was supposedly helping out by babysitting a neighbor's toddler. And wouldn't you know it, she claimed the child had swallowed something and rushed to another neighbor's house to help. And well, they called 911 at least, but when the paramedics arrived, they discovered the boy had a wad of paper towels stuck in his throat. Rosa Heinous, the babysitter, she claimed it was an accident, that the boy had gotten a hold of paper towels and eaten them when she wasn't looking. And the child's mother confirmed the boy did like to play with paper towels. And yet the police believed Rosa did it on purpose. That is, if Dr. Peacock reviewed the autopsy and agreed. And in the case of Rosa Heinous, she did. And she confirmed. She believed, indeed, the boy's deadly choking incident was a homicide. 3 months later, in April of 2003, the police stormed the house of a sleeping, heavily pregnant Rosa Heinous, largely based on the medical examiner's testimony. She was charged with and ultimately convicted of this child's murder, and she was sentenced to over 150 years in prison. While incarcerated, Rosa gave birth to her son. She named him Emmanuel. While shackled, she was allowed to hold her boy for 5 hours. Then he was taken away from her, and the boy, along with her 1-year-old daughter, were put into foster care. Not that anyone had much sympathy for a convicted child killer like Rosa Heinous. And now it seemed here was another case of an overwhelmed young mother unleashing her repressed rage on someone else's child. Dr. Peacock not only believed this death was a homicide. In her view, the child had been held down in that water, and then she let him suffer for hours until she decided to get medical attention, knowing that it was too late. On July 30th, Carmen Mejia was charged with felony murder, injury to a child with serious injury, and injury to a child by omission. Essentially, deadly negligence. And so she was taken into custody, where she would spend the next 2 years awaiting trial. And during that time, she was convinced that somehow she would get out of this. They had to know she would never hurt a child. She had no history of hurting children. And there was nothing, as far as she knew, that connected her directly to what happened in this case. She would have her day in court, and everyone there would see she wasn't a killer. Unfortunately, the Carmen Mejia that the prosecution described at her trial, she was a killer. The prosecution had expert and witnesses, one after another, each one more damning of Carmen's actions than the next. And they ran circles around her court-appointed attorneys, who didn't call a single expert to testify in her defense. At one point, a desperate Carmen shouted, "I didn't do it." But prosecutor Ann O'Connell told the jury not to believe anything Carmen the liar said. This is a crime that came from someplace deep within her, a dark, black, evil place in her heart. On September 27th, 2005, the jury found Carmen Mejia guilty on all 3 counts. And she was given 3 life sentences, 1 for each charge. Later, members of the jury would say they didn't want to convict Carmen. They felt sorry for her. But the deciding factor in their verdict were her lies, the lies she told in her police interview. The jury wasn't aware that Carmen actually did confess and tell the truth at the 14th hour of her interrogation. Only, as you might recall, that confession wasn't recorded, so it was never submitted as evidence. They had no idea it existed. Likewise, the jury wasn't aware that at one point there was recorded testimony from her children that supported her story, and that those tapes had been lost. During the trial, her children did testify via closed-circuit TV, but by then 2 years had passed. The children told all different stories, and it didn't help her case. It may have even hurt it. Some would say she was lucky she didn't get the death penalty. But after her conviction, she was dealt one fatal, final blow. Her children. It appears her husband was unable to care for their children, and without close family, Carmen's 4 children were taken from her, placed in foster care. Then, after she was convicted, they were adopted by a whole new family. This adoption was closed, which meant Carmen had no idea where her children went or who adopted them. She wasn't allowed to contact them. And, in turn, they weren't allowed to contact her. They didn't need to give Carmen the death penalty. Losing her children was a fate worse than death. In the beginning, she thought her case was special, that somehow this injustice would get some attention. When she went to prison, she discovered it was filled with women just like her. Immigrant caretakers, babysitters, nannies, all accused and convicted of hurting, even killing children left in their care. This included one of her cellmates, Rosa Jimenez. 2 women essentially convicted of the same crime. 2 women doomed to spend the rest of their life in prison. And 2 women determined to prove their innocence. Over the next several years, Carmen tried to fight her conviction. A woman who couldn't read or write slowly gained fluency in the criminal justice system, filing appeals and then getting rejected every time. By 2015, she'd exhausted her options. She had no choice but to accept a cold, hard truth. She was going to spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she did not commit. She was alone and forgotten, even by her own children. But there was one person who still remembered Carmen Mejia. She didn't know him, and honestly, he didn't know her. He'd only seen her from afar. but he'd thought of her every single day for 10 years. God knows he tried, but he just couldn't forget. The case of Carmen Mejia. For most of his life, 55-year-old Art Guerrero, that's Guerrero, wore some kind of uniform. First as a member of the U.S. Air Force, then as a deputy in the Travis County Sheriff's Office, after that, airport police. But the one he wore as a bailiff in the Travis County Courthouse, this uniform would be his last. After this job, he'd retire. Art figured he'd pretty much seen it all. DWIs, robberies, murder cases. Then in September of 2005, he witnessed a crime, or what should have been a crime. A shocking display he couldn't believe. The trial of Carmen Mejia. As the courthouse bailiff, Art's job wasn't to judge. It was to ensure order in the courtroom, to guard and protect everyone in that courtroom, from judges to members of the jury, even the defendants. And it was brutally obvious from the very first day of her trial. Carmen Mejia needed protection from her own incompetent attorneys. Art hadn't gone to law school, but by 2005, he'd seen enough trials to know when a defendant's team was in over their heads. And he knew, from day one, Carmen's team, they were no match for the prosecution. It wasn't just inexperience. It was a matter of resources. A top criminal attorney costs money. The best can cost at least $500 an hour. Carmen Mejia was poor, so she had a court-appointed counsel. Just two people. Two people to tackle a murder case that relied almost entirely on expert testimony. The prosecution could afford to hire any number of experts to support their side. And in Carmen's case, that's exactly what they did. Over the course of her week-long trial, the prosecution had one expert who apparently invented some foolproof method of burn analysis. And that expert said, with 100% certainty, the pattern of this child's injuries was caused by an adult forcing a child in bathwater, not some 4-year-old girl. There were other experts along those lines. Then they had the medical examiner, Dr. Peacock, who determined the death was a homicide and supported this version of events. As for the charge of deadly negligence, one expert said if Carmen had taken the boy to the hospital sooner, he could have survived. Carmen's attorneys did not have a single expert to counter any of these claims. At one point, they did have a burn expert, only to discover just before trial that their expert wasn't credible, and they didn't have enough funds to hire a new one. Her attorneys also made the questionable decision of thrusting poor Carmen up into the witness stand where she had to defend herself. And this put Carmen at a profound disadvantage. She spoke in Spanish in a voice so quiet and fearful you could barely hear her. Art was born and raised in Austin, Texas, but he was of Mexican heritage and spoke Spanish, so he felt the impact of her words. But others in the courtroom, including members of the jury, they didn't speak Spanish. And her words, when repeated in a flat tone by a court-appointed translator, the honesty, the emotion, it got lost. Art kept waiting for the actual physical evidence to be presented against her, but there wasn't any. Just those made-up stories, her different versions of events. And lying made her look bad, but it wasn't enough to convict someone of murder. Art wasn't naive. He knew innocent people went to prison. But when the jury found Carmen guilty, he was devastated. Her sentencing was even more heartbreaking. The boys' grieving parents each read a statement aloud, wondering, why did she do it? And Carmen couldn't help but cry out that she didn't do it. But it didn't matter. Those parents believed the prosecution, that Carmen had this cold, dark, evil heart, and she'd ruin their lives. He believed in his heart she was innocent. And when she was sentenced to life in prison, Art knew he had to do something, say something to someone. But who? A judge? And what would he say? That Carmen Mieja had lousy lawyers? That the jury was wrong? Art was a rule follower, a peacemaker. He didn't like to make trouble. He liked to get along. Art told himself it wasn't his place to say anything. He was just a bailiff. And if he crossed the line and trumpeted his opinion, well, he might even lose his job. So he pushed his feelings aside, believing that someone else, someone actually qualified, would soon take up Carmen's case, and Carmen would get justice. But year after year, no one did. And Art prayed for her every day. But the weight of it all, it ate at him. He felt guilty and ashamed. He knew what happened was wrong, but he didn't know how to make it right. In 2015, Art retired, putting an end to his courthouse career. And at the age of 65, he began his crusade to save Carmen Mejia. But where to begin? He'd always been on the other side of this. How do you unconvict someone? So he did a little search, something along the lines of how to get someone out of prison. And lo and behold, he found the contact information for a nonprofit in New York City called the Innocence Project. But he was up against some tough odds. A nonprofit like that could only handle so many cases. And typically, the ones that the Innocence Project takes on tend to be convictions overturned with new DNA evidence. As all of that unfolded, Art got up the courage to approach a trusted judge. The two had worked together for years. And he told him the whole Carmen story. The judge said he'd look into it. But he had to know it was hard to overturn a conviction and prove actual innocence unless there was new evidence. But there was a bit of good news. Since Carmen's conviction in 2005, there had been a bit of a shakeup in Travis County. This included a regime change with a new district attorney who was willing to revisit certain cases. Art and the judge connected with the district attorney, who said he was open to reviewing this case. And finally, in 2021, the Innocence Project agreed to take on Carmen's case. They brought to light some of the careless mistakes made during the original investigation, including losing the kids' interviews corroborating Carmen's version of events, and what appeared to be an assumption of guilt from the very beginning. An entire investigation done in bad faith. There were other scenarios they hadn't even considered. Investigators had taken the temperature of the water in that apartment twice, and both of those times, the temperature was 30 degrees hotter than it was supposed to be. And therefore, the issue was not who put the child in the water, but the temperature of the water itself. And if that's the case, then it's not a murder charge against a young mother, but a lawsuit against a potentially negligent building owner. And that lawsuit could have forged change so that all the landlords in Austin, Texas were required to ensure their unit water heaters are set to the maximum temperature of a safer, standard 120 degrees. But this was just one of many revelations that came out of that reinvestigation. By 2024, Carmen's case had gained enough traction that there were a series of hearings. And in these hearings, new experts testified. And these bona fide experts, they lent crucial new insight into what happened. And in these hearings, they introduced a medical safety expert from Johns Hopkins and a leading burn surgeon to testify. The injuries were consistent with an accident. They testified that Carmen Mejia was not negligent. Even if she'd taken him to the hospital within seconds, he likely wouldn't have survived. They also dug into the background of the prosecution's original burn expert and swiftly discredited his testimony as junk science. His so-called foolproof system of burn analysis turned out to be a work of fiction. And again, thanks to Art's efforts, they were able to track down Carmen's 4 children, who were now adults. And they discovered something remarkable. Not only had Carmen's children not forgotten their mother, they'd searched for her for years, even hiring a private investigator to find out where their mother was, without success. Anna, who was by then in her 20s, hadn't forgotten that day. It was painfully seared in her memory, how she wanted to give the boy a bath, how she turned on the water, and the terror that followed. At one of her mother's hearings, she told the judge she was 100% certain she was the one who turned on the water. Undoubtedly, the most crucial testimony came from the medical examiner, Dr. Peacock. To her great credit, she recognized she made a mistake, and in 2025, she changed the death certificate from homicide to accident. There was a lot more to it than that, of course, but those were a few highlights that helped Carmen's case. In March of 2026, after nearly 23 years behind bars, Carmen Mejia was officially exonerated. And during that hearing, she even received an apology from the state of Texas. An assistant district attorney in Travis County apologized to Carmen Mejia directly. And in his apology, he referenced the trial prosecutor, who at the time said Carmen Mejia had the coldest, darkest, blackest, most evil heart a person could have. And he wanted it known on the record. They could not have been more wrong. In late March of 2026, Carmen walked out of prison. By then, Carmen was 54 years old. When she walked out, she had gray hair, bore a big smile, and the daughters who she hadn't seen in 23 years ran to her. And as they hugged and cried, all of those decades melted away. In late April of 2026, Art received a special congressional honor in the U.S. House of Representatives for his role in Carmen Mejia's exoneration. Art, now in his 70s and wearing a bright yellow necktie, was moved to tears. It was an incredible honor. But the true reward that day was when he finally met Carmen Mejia face to face. Throughout all of those years, when Carmen thought she was alone, she had no idea that for 10 years, the bailiff at her trial was out there somewhere, fighting for her release. When she finally found out who Art was and what he had done for her, she couldn't believe it. But Carmen didn't understand. All of those years, she was locked away in prison. Art was trapped under the weight of his own conscience. And when they finally met and hugged and cried, he would hold her hands and tell her the day she got out of prison was the day he was free. Coincidentally, a stranger also stepped in to help save the life of Rosa Jimenez. Now, Rosa Jimenez's story, it could be a whole other episode. But briefly, right around the time Carmen's case gained traction, the Innocence Project also got involved in Rosa's case. And a reinvestigation in her case revealed the choking death of the child in her care back in 2003 was an accident. And Rosa was also exonerated and released from prison after 20 years. Once out of prison, Rosa faced a new battle, one that was life or death. At just 41 years old, Rosa had end-stage kidney disease. And if she didn't receive a new kidney, Rosa would die. Now, securing a new kidney might be the one thing more difficult than getting out of prison. The current waiting list for a new kidney is 92,000 people long, with an estimated wait time of around 5 years. Rosa Jimenez did not have 5 years, so her family and supporters started a campaign for her. And that campaign just happened to catch the attention of the San Antonio Spurs coach Greg Popovich. And he helped spread the word by urging basketball fans to help find Rosa a donor. And through word of mouth, someone stepped forward and offered to donate their kidney. And the kidney was a match. And in September of 2024, Rosa underwent a kidney transplant, and the transplant was a success. Rosa still has no idea who the donor was, only that he was a healthy 51-year-old man in Colorado who chooses to remain anonymous. And there's something really wonderful about that. That somewhere out there is a low-key, one-kidney man with a heart of gold. And these are just 2 stories. Think about how many other strangers are out there, ready and willing to save someone's life. And who knows, that stranger might be you. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Dead Sleep. And if you are intrigued by these events, I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes. I'll be back in about 10 days with another episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. Thank you so much for listening. Until then, nighty-night.